Senator Rice. Senator Fierravanti-Wells.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. And as somebody who's lived my life across the diversity that is today contemporary Australia and been very actively engaged in our cultural diversity, I was very pleased to participate in this inquiry, and having also been a former minister in this space, I thought this was a very timely inquiry and a timely report. Can I too associate myself with the comments of the Chair, your Chair, Senator Kitching, the Deputy Chair, Senator Abetz, and the comments, some of the comments that Senator Rice herself made as well. Look, I'd like to focus on a number of the recommendations. Of course, the first recommendation being the need to further recognise the contributions of our diaspora communities in Australia. I mean, half of us were either born overseas or have at least one parent who was born overseas. But I think that one of the important recommendations is that of number 5, and that is recommending that the government consider increasing the awareness of the National Security Hotline as a means of reporting foreign interference by way of multilingual media or information campaign. And of course the evidence that came before us very much pointed to where this foreign interference is. And as somebody, and as other senators have said, whilst there were a number of totalitarian regimes that were identified in the inquiry, nevertheless, clearly the country that attracted the most attention was definitely China. And as somebody who has been very outspoken against the communist regime, and indeed when I was minister I made some comments which resulted in an international debate about China's activities, most especially in the Pacific. And I too felt that as I was speaking out on that issue that there weren't many people who were interested in listening to the warnings that I was making in relation to the regime. My comments, prescient as they were, I believe have been fully vindicated. But as more and more has become obvious about what the communist regime is doing, not just internationally but most especially here in Australia, we saw in this inquiry the face of what that foreign interference really is. Those ordinary Australians, particularly of Chinese heritage, and there's 1.2 million of them, who are the human face of this interference. And so, therefore, I think that that is really the most important takeout. One of the other recommendations was also about Magnitsky and the encouraging the government to enact Magnitsky legislation. And so, therefore, if we are going to enact Magnitsky legislation, we have to make sure that the agencies that are going to have the powers to enforce that legislation are adequately resourced. And I have to say that over the Christmas vacation period, I was very disappointed with AUSTRAC and what happened with AUSTRAC and the issue in relation to the transfer of Vatican funds. And if that's the sort of basic error that an organisation like AUSTRAC is undertaking, then I think that we have to take a very, very serious look to ensure that our agencies are up to speed to be able to undertake the necessary work to enforce the Magnitsky laws here in Australia. Can I go specifically to some of the evidence in the inquiries? And we know that it is clear, particularly in relation to the communist regime, we saw firsthand the work that the United Front Work Department of the CCP Central Committee is doing here in Australia. And yes, we had seen the work that Professor Clive Hamilton and the work that he did and the books that he's written, and also the work of Dr Alex Joske, and can I commend both of them for the contribution that they have made to the body politic, but most especially in relation to this issue. And we saw firsthand the insidious practices in Australia of Beijing loyalists, and these insidious practices here in Australia by people loyal to Beijing have caused alarm to our Chinese Australian community, many who have escaped persecution and want to live freely in a democratic Australia, and they do feel intimidated. They have made an important contribution to the fabric of our community, and they have been a strong advocate. They have been strong advocates for democracy and for our multicultural society, and therefore, can I underline the comment that was made earlier? The criticisms that I have made, and I know that others have made, have been against the communist regime. They have not been against the Chinese people, and certainly not against the 1.2 million Australians of Chinese heritage who have warmly embraced our way of life, but whose way of life now feels very threatened as a consequence of Beijing's bellicose activities. And we know that the communist regime has a track history in relation to illegal and bellicose activities. We see it daily in the South China Sea. And so, therefore, from that perspective, Australia, if we honestly say that we want a values-based foreign policy, then we have to stand by that, and we have to stand up when countries like China and other totalitarian regimes do not act as good international citizens. And that means calling them out when they do not act in accordance with international norms. And so, therefore, if we say that our foreign policy is a projection of our values and beliefs, therefore, it is important that, of course, we support the international rules-based order, but we need to stand up for those values. And we need to stand up for those values even when there are commercial consequences. And when we see the egregious abuses of human rights by some of these totalitarian regimes, and we are seeing it, as Senator Abetz said, at the moment, there it is on the BBC, we're seeing what is happening to the Uyghurs. But it's also important that countries like Australia join with other nations. And can I also say it would be really good to see Muslim countries also standing up for their Muslim brothers and sisters who are now facing the persecution in China. And so, therefore, it's not only incumbent on democratic countries like Australia to call out that, but also I think it's important for us to encourage other countries, and particularly other countries in the Muslim world, to also speak out in this way. We have to understand that China is not a democracy. It is a totalitarian regime, and therefore we need to treat it as such, rather than thinking that we can continue as business as usual. We cannot continue business as usual with the communist regime. It's not going to work anymore. And quite frankly, the Australian public is not going to stand for business as usual with the communist regime anymore. So, can I, in particular, before I conclude, I want to touch on the effect also of the Hong Kong security law. This is a very bad law, and I know that so many people in Australia fear its application, not just if they go back to Hong Kong, also because so many people in the diasporas have connections in these countries, in China, in Vietnam, in other countries where they do fear for repercussions for their citizens. Can I conclude on a couple of recommendations? One is the recommendation 12, 14 and 15, 17 and 18, which effectively go to communication with diaspora communities. When I became Minister for International Development and the Pacific, one of the things I asked for was, did we have an ethnic media listing in the Department of Foreign Affairs? I was so disappointed. There was not an up-to-date list of ethnic media. And let's not forget that the ethnic media in this country is 500-600 strong and growing every day, because our diasporas get their news from around the world in different ways. So therefore it is vitally important that we utilise the diaspora communities and utilise that media to more effectively communicate with government.